Darin Barney is a professor in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University. He's written some really impactful work in communication studies generally and received several awards for his academic work. He's a member of the Petrocultures Research Group, the After Oil Collective, and Future Energy Systems at the University of Alberta, among other groups. Jesse Goldstein is an assistant professor of sociology at Virginia Commonwealth University. He's a printmaker and has been a member of numerous art collectives, including Space 1026 in Philadelphia and more recently the Occuprint Collective. His current research focuses on the political economy of green technologies. Hannah Tollefson is a media and environmental studies scholar who works on questions of ecology, economy, and infrastructure. She studies how territory is technically mediated, the work of infrastructure in shaping relations of place, scale, and the politics of energy transition. She and Darin are currently working on a project that focuses on the development of oil sands bitumen for non-combustion uses. Their research has taken them into the boardrooms of companies that are vying for a place in the market for solid-state bitumen. With Jesse's work, there's a focus on how greenwashing, as we know it, has evolved into an ideology of only valuing innovation and imagination within narrow market terms, even when the innovation in question is devoted to cracking the climate crisis. In both instances, there is, in this critique of capitalist enclosure of clean energy or emerging forms of fuel, a sense that actually those who are involved do want to have a positive social impact. The issue is that, as Jesse argues, the narrowing of innovation under capitalism means that these sorts of entrepreneurs are more or less obligated to concentrate their energy on doing well financially rather than doing good socially or ecologically. So, there's a lot to talk about. I think there's a million kind of, nodes and points of connection between the research that the three of you have done within sort of like, we could say the energy humanities, but I feel like we should start with the basics. So Darin and Hannah, you've written about how very often climate change discourse hinges on the question of like carbon, right? And carbon, and correctly, it should, but that like carbon is conflated with carbon dioxide. And like, I just think that's an interesting basic point that there is this kind of root conflation in the discourse. And that also, the combustion of fossil fuels is identified as the primary source of carbon dioxide emissions and the leading cause of global heating. That's just like explaining the sort of scientific refrain that we tend to hear when climate change is discussed. The other thing you mentioned is that the elimination, reduction, or redistribution of carbon dioxide emissions is often styled simply as decarbonization. So like, I just think it's important for us to flag the terms, which, hold so much power in a bunch of different spheres of activity. Jesse, your recent writing talks about another term that dates back to the 1990s, which has now gained a lot of attention, net zero, right? So the question I want us to kind of start with is, why are the terms that we use the terms that we use, right? Like net zero is this idea, it's this ideology as well. It's notoriously unclear. It poses these challenges for communication. And yeah, I mean, maybe we could pick it up from there. What's going on in terms of naming the things and what kind of work does it do?
I mean, I guess, yeah, one of the kind of interesting, or one of, I guess, an interesting refrain that I think orients us to some of the research we're looking at, which is about this kind of efforts to rehabilitate oil sands bitumen in a future increasingly recast in net zero terms, is something we have heard from some of the people, some of the entrepreneurs and scientists that we've spoken to in Alberta, working around creating post-combustion uses for oil sands bitumen, which they describe as a process of decarbonizing heavy oil.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in that phrase, we can kind of almost see the different ways that carbon is being understood, either as kind of a source of emissions, a molecule that can be kind of rearranged, presumably to different effects. Um, and so I think, yeah, the basis of our project is, or one of them at least, is to kind of try and understand what the decarbonization of heavy oil as this kind of like seemingly contradictory um, proposition means to people, and what that might, what kind of politics kind of gathers around that idea, and yeah, how it came about.
Mm-hmm. It's like, the decarbonizing of heavy oil becomes the kind of lesser of two evils or whatever. Like you can have fossil fuels, but they're sort of abated. That's the term that's sometimes used, right?
Right.
Um,
I mean, one of the interesting aspects of that, in relation, at least to the project that we're looking at, is that it's the non-combustion orientation of this effort that we're tracking in Alberta amounts to not treating Alberta bitumen as a source of fuel at all. So it's almost like you can have the bitumen without it, and capitalize on the bitumen as a resource without it becoming fossil fuel. That would be a kind of accurate, I think, rendering of the impetus for the bitumen beyond combustion program in Alberta right now. Is, look, we project a future in which the market demand for heavy oil derived from Alberta bitumen is going to diminish significantly. And is there something that we can direct that resource toward that will continue to facilitate accumulation of some kind?
right.
Uh, and one of the strategies that has been settled on is directing that material towards non-fuel applications, toward post-combustion or non-combustion applications that include things like the development of asphalt binder, spinning carbon fibers out of Alberta bitumen, developing advanced carbon materials and carbon nanotubes that can be used in things like advanced filtration and sensing technologies, etc., etc. But what's interesting to us is that gets called decarbonization, because decarbonization is a contemporary term of art within emerging green capitalism, right? Which basically implies some kind of reduction of carbon dioxide emission profiles. That's what uh, decarbonization means. But the development of non-combustion products for Alberta bitumen just fundamentally, materially relies on the carbon-based properties of that material. So decarbonization doesn't really describe what's going on materially in the attempt to develop these new commodity forms out of
Mm-hmm.
bitumen as a source material. And so, what part of the work that Hannah and I are trying to do is trying to kind of map out and analyze what's at stake in the development of that language in relation to emerging forms of green capitalism in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you say you're studying it closely, and that's like what I love about the work that you're doing is that you're not taking these terms at face value. And there is a way, I think, Jesse, you're writing about net zero suggests that there's something seductive about the term, that it does provide this kind of simple narrative of like drawdown and decarbonization. And you say that its broad acceptance and deployment represents a new moment in liberal and corporate environmentalism. I think that's true, where like decarbonization is experienced as something that is really happening. And even most seductively being led by the industries that created the climate crisis, right? So something's going on here in terms of the capture of net zero. Did you want to provide any sort of like
Sure.
history of it or like a sense of its function?
Well, I do see this as like a long history of um, green capitalism, to use just like an umbrella term, And by that, I would say like strategies whereby capital and states operating alongside of capital need to find ways to legitimize business as usual or accumulation as usual in the face of pretty unassailable environmental critiques, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this goes back to environmental critiques from Rachel Carson through the 70s. And in each moment, you see effectively a need, both in like the business press and then in sort of like circles of corporate and political governance, a need to manage those contradictions, right? And so like just like the contradictions y'all are talking about with decarbonization of carbon, right? It's like capital is a contradictory system of accumulation, right? That like can't square its own circle. And so you have to have a legitimizing discourse or a way of narrating why things are under control and why up is not down, why, you know, exploitation is actually growth or flourishing, et cetera, right? And so, I mean, this goes beyond just green narratives, but, you know, that's what we're, I guess, effectively concerned with. And so, you know, I guess I see net zero as like, just like the next iteration of trying to figure out a marketing push, a PR initiative, a way to name the management of a critique amidst a desire to do nothing effectively, right? And so, you know, what I sort of the provocation I think I'm seeing or want to put out there is if, you know, we saw the fossil fuel giants focusing on strategies of just full on denial, you know, climate change isn't real. And then that shifts into a strategy of delay. Well, the science is iffy, right? Let's figure out if it's really true, or we need to do more research. It feels like, and you know, I saw this really clearly, well, in some of the language out of the recent COP, but also in like some of the PR that Shell Oil is putting out. The next step is, no, it is really happening. You guys are right. Climate change is a real, imminent, and grave danger. We got this. So let's all get on board our triumphant techno-solutionist sort of mission to fix things. And you know, they do it in this the sort of affective strategy, or the sort of like the resonance that I see happening is this idea of sort of like it's managing these contradictions. So it's like, let's urgently deal with this crisis patiently as we let our sort of, you know, carbon capture systems scale up, or as we wait for nuclear fission to be a viable technology. So it's like there's an urgency that you're asked to defer to their patient sort of development of this of the next round of technosocial solutions, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not an urgency that should be met with political disruptions. It's not an urgency that should be met with a questioning of this petrocapital status quo, right? And so it's like, shit, we know it's urgent. I guess what we have to do is recuperate that urgency into a new narrative of how we get it and we're doing something about it.
Mm-hmm.
Jesse, I will say that I thought that was one of the most resonant passages in the paper that you shared with us about that very particular temporality, like the matching of capitalist enterprises' embrace of the language of urgency in the service of a kind of request for patience and waiting and we've got this, and like that it kind of gives or it grants the developers of capitalist technologies a kind of long leash in a way, like temporally speaking, like a timeline in which, okay, we can wait for CCUS is not here yet, but it's going to come, it's on its way. And so like this, it's really an interesting temporal framework that you've developed there in which like urgency turns into something like patience rather than immediate limitation or accelerated transformation or something like that.
Yeah, and if I could build on that, I think that, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Darin. The piece that I also find really interesting, and I'm curious if you all see this, is what that then also creates is this very sort of selective frame where if you like a technology, it is patiently, urgently being created, just give it time. And if you don't like a technology, or I should say a socio-technology, right? It's irrational. It could never work. And the counterfactual is imagining it instantaneously happening, and therefore that would be crazy. So like I'm thinking specifically about the way that agroecology and other land-based solutions get denigrated. And there's this other side of the narrative where it's like, oh, well, that could never scale up. That could never happen. What are we going to do if we got rid of industrial agriculture tomorrow and then all of a sudden had a bunch of small landholders? We couldn't feed the world's billions. So there's this like imagination that if you don't like a technology, if it happened tomorrow, it would be disastrous and impossible, and therefore it's irrational. But if you like a technology, it's not here yet, but we're getting there. And believe you me, we'll scale up industrially once we're ready.
I guess one thing that this makes me think of as well is that there's a way that the kind of like urgency and scale framing of a lot of the conversations around transition operate that kind of happens in this ideal register where it's about, transforming and I think like necessarily this kind of scale gets evoked because these systems are so planetary in many ways, but it's about, so then we're thinking about the agroecology on an industrial planetary scale. And the problem is that it does kind of lend itself to an argument like, okay, well, if we did this tomorrow, everything would fall apart. And I think what gets lost in that is like the question of maybe how we get there, or like, where are we, understanding, thinking more in terms of like the political terrain that exists and mapping out how we get from point A to point B, as opposed to staging the debate in these kinds of broad ideal scale terms, almost lends itself to this kind of thinking in a way.
Mm-hmm. The case that Hannah and I are looking at, one of the things that we're trying to leave ourselves open to is that that what's going on with the bitumen beyond combustion program, or at least the prospect that's being developed about a shift toward non-combustion uses of this resource, could actually have real significant material effects vis-a-vis something like carbon dioxide emissions associated with Alberta bitumen. Because even though the bitumen would still need to be extracted and there's all the emissions and environmental deficits associated with that, at the end of the day, at the other end, if you're diverting that material to non-combustion uses, you're removing 80% of the emissions that are normally attached with the use of that material. So it's not so easy in this case, in this particular case. It's different with CCUS. It's different with other kinds of abatement technologies, etc. This is a very particular case where we might have to stop for a moment and consider the complex ways in which initiatives like this might actually have material effects that could be interesting for us to consider and add complexity to our accounts of why green capitalism can't solve all our problems. This is not an easy case of saying this is a far-fetched, non-transformative, business as usual kind of initiative, because it actually at the material level holds out the prospect of something that might be interesting. Vis-a-vis a kind of environmentally significant alteration in the profile of that resource. Still extractive, etc., all the things, but nevertheless not the same as an easy to dismiss technology such as CCUS as simple greenwashing. Right, in a way, and I think this is here I have to give credit to Hannah, is that she's really established this framework for this project where we might need to think about attempts by capitalism to incorporate environmental sensibility that are not simply greenwashing, right?
Sure.
That are actual attempts to materially incorporate the environment into the cycle of accumulation in ways that can't simply be dismissed as business as usual. And that's kind of what we're trying to get at in this project.
And it's like a super complex thing that you're trying to do. You're trying to kind of, you use the language of rehabilitation, right? The idea of rehabilitating or recuperating something that is, awash in just like toxic effects, and so, I think I absolutely want to, unpack that research like in detail and some of the methods that you're using and some of the potential outcomes. But, we've used this word over and over again in the conversation already. And I want us to like unpack it first. The other word that's worth making sure we understand is capitalism. I had a student just straight up ask me recently what capitalism was. And I was weirdly excited at the chance to try and define it. Jesse, you wrote in your book, Planetary Improvement, that capitalism is like climate change, something that is planetary in scale, equally abstract, all encompassing, and seemingly unstoppable, and that it must immediately be addressed. And what I loved about that section of the book is that you're also talking about how it's very hard to put capitalism on the table, right? Because you make yourself vulnerable to what you call red baiting aspersions meant to silence the inquiry. So like before we take apart and dismantle, capitalism, we kind of have to, as you kind of just gestured to, Darin, like defend, if only for rhetorical reasons, the like advances that fossil fueled capitalism has enabled. Now, I don't know that we need to do that. I'm suggesting, I guess, that we need to do that. But this is certainly something that you're all writing about in different ways, right? The things that we might be able to rehabilitate in capitalism. There's a way in which rhetorically, politically, it's hard to argue for anti-capitalist climate action. For a lot of people, it's just like a non-starter. For folks like us, maybe it's just the language we speak. Do we need to kind of think in terms of whether, to what extent it's like complacent or self-indulgent to attack capitalism in this moment, or is it absolutely necessary?
My understanding of capitalism has a lot to do with capital as value and what value means, and the process of a world that was not always capitalist becoming capitalist, right? Which sometimes people call an ongoing process of primitive accumulation or of enclosure, or it's like wrapped up with imperialism, it's in colonialism, but I see capitalism, at least some dimensions that I feel like are important for this conversation, as a narrowing, as a sort of a shifting of a potent world that has a million possibilities, a million brains, a million ideas, just like an exuberant proliferation of creativity narrowed into the potential to be creatively more and more effective at accumulating capital, right? So it's like taking a world that is many-sided and turning it into this one-sided pursuit of capital meaning a certain way to understand value that is itself sort of like self-justifying, self-cannibalizing, self-legitimizing, of just sort of this like weirdly dematerialized sense of like value for value's sake, right? And so the pursuit of wealth as capital, right? These like monetary figures that can extend from whatever I have in my bank account to the trillions required to solve the climate crisis. This is a vision or a way of seeing the world as a problem defined by capital, right? And it's like, oh, okay, in that mindset, maybe we just need 8 trillion or 12 trillion or 20 trillion units of capital to solve the crisis. But I would say, no, what we actually need is a dislodgement from the logic of value for value's sake, from this narrowing of creativity into only validating the creativity that is good at becoming productive of capital, and opening ourselves up to the proliferation of other possibilities, technological, social, political, that might actually lead towards an environmentally and socially just world.
And certainly planetary improvement is about the ways in which clean tech tries to sort of like harness the positive vibes of a different value system, right? Preservation of the
Yeah.
future and of the environment for the purpose of generating what is like a more licit and legible form of value, which is like just straight up business, right?
Yeah, and this might relate to. I'd actually love to hear if this resonates with your guys' research, Darin and Hannah. But like when I did the research for planetary improvement, I would sort of self-critically. I feel like I went into it thinking I'm going to have this like gotcha sort of account of like evil green capitalists who just do evil green capitalist stuff, and it was just going to be like all a bunch of bull crap, and I would write about it, and it would be like one-dimensional. And obviously, the world is far richer and more interesting than that. And the thing that I think I found most compelling through my fieldwork is how much positive energy there was coming out of these inventors. And I don't even want to call them entrepreneurs. I want to call them inventors, because I feel like they only they like had to be pulled into that label of entrepreneur. For a lot of them, they were like, I want to make the world. I want to make cool technologies and systems that I could imagine being actually ecologically vibrant. But the only way to do it is to get investment. The only way to do it is to pitch to an investor, to get money. And then all of a sudden, it's in that process of making your creativity viable by tapping into social wealth, which we currently are only really able to tap into as capital, that all of a sudden you're starting to focus on the commercial viability, the market share, the like ways that you can fit your technology into the status quo and show incremental improvements on what already exists. And then all of a sudden, all those dreams of the inventor kind of sort of like have to filter away, because the narrowing that capital does says, I get it, you have tons of ideas, but what I want to see is, can you make me money?
I found Jesse's account, and certainly in the book, just the account of that experience of being in the field. And I know that's one of your interesting questions that you raised, Scott, is also, well, what's the status of field research in relation to this kind of work? I don't know if you want to say something about that, Hannah, because you've been in there in all those labs.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely something that I really appreciated about the planetary improvement book, and which like really resonated with the work that we're doing. I think you describe it, and like the term you put it in the book is like the idea of emotional and material investment that some of these people have, and kind of looking to chart how those things work together. And I do think that going into the field, it becomes so much more difficult to render a kind of one-dimensional account of these things. And you really kind of, I've found myself kind of get taken by the people's stories and how they relate to the work that they're doing. And I think this also kind of gets to what's so complicated about ideology, is that it's not just wrong, but Darin and I were just talking about this, but that it's kind of the way that people are able to like live the contradictions of their life. Mm-hmm. And we all live that in different ways, very uneven ways, obviously. But I do think that that's such a kind of an impactful effect of fieldwork. And it kind of also, as a researcher, puts you kind of into contact with like the stories that you tell yourself. And, you have to also, in engaging with those interlocutors and interviewees or informants or whoever they might be, like to give an account of yourself too, and where you're coming from in those meetings. And I think that that's also like a productive moment to just kind of understand where you're coming from and like what the stakes are of the research that you're doing. And to kind of articulate that to a person who maybe, lives in a somewhat different world, but nonetheless in a shared world with you. Yeah, that's definitely been a generative process that has definitely led us to places that we didn't anticipate.
And absolutely, like a different kind of emotional register from which to produce writing, produce thought. And I love that gesture to this idea of like an emotional investment, right? You're doing field work, which I find fascinating, right? Field work in energy humanities seems to me like this path-breaking kind of brand new thing. And yeah, so like doing field work on the transmutation of tar sands bitumen into something else, something we build with rather than burn, I guess, hypothetically, is obviously teaching you something about the ways that technology companies and startups imagine themselves, but it's also causing you to like reflect on how you imagine yourself in this work. And just like I know that the way I often operate in terms of trying to crack the problem of radical climate action is anger. Like a lot of it is just like anger coming up, which is not always the most constructive force or place from which to write and think. But it is nonetheless a kind of investment, right, in a kind of antagonism, call it class antagonism, whatever. But yeah, I mean, the disposition we have obviously has an effect. And I wondered if we wanted to kind of move to a discussion of that sort of like emotional investment, maybe around this idea in your work, Jesse, of like impact. You know, like you do a lot of theorizing of this question of, or not question, like the what you called like an ideal register of impact, of having a positive impact. You say it can be a noun, an adverb, an adjective, impact, impactful,
Yeah.
impacting. It is emotional and economic. And there's something undeniably aspirational about it that's at the core of what you call clean tech entrepreneurialism. Um, but yeah, I think there was a little bit something like satirical about that for me too, like the clean tech space being about impact. It's like impacting what, right? Did you want to speak to
Yeah, sure.
that
And I
sort
don't
of?
think this is unique to clean tech. I think this is entrepreneurial culture more broadly, right? To be an entrepreneur, you have to go up in front of a room and pitch that you're going to change the world, right? Or you're going to make an impact. And this is true in the real world. It's true in like, satirical accounts of making fun of entrepreneurship. It's just sort of like, it's this real thing where there's a sense that you're making worlds, and impact is like the language or the singular concept to sort of gesture at this thing that like I'm not just reproducing the status quo or reproducing what is, right? And so many of these stories, I'd hear these folks being like, I didn't want to just sell aluminum foil, or I didn't want to just, and it would be like, some aspect of the boring economy, I needed to make an impact, right? And so the irony is like, you could make energy efficient aluminum foil and that's impactful. But if you just made aluminum foil, it's boring, right? And so there was this sense that like there was some sort of valence or potency to the cleaning of the normal wasteful world that felt impactful, right? And I see that in your bitumen research, right? It's like sure. We've just had like a whole bunch of critiques about how the tar sands are like, an ecological tragedy. So let's not go there. Let's clean up this field of waste. And then I can get excited about my slice of cleaning the waste, right? And then it's like, and obviously all these technologies are predicated on that substrate. Go ahead, Darin. Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're kind of circling around here, talking about, is like trying to get a handle on how something like climate change went from being the worst thing that ever happened to capitalism to the best thing that ever happened to capitalism, right? And there's a way in which there's multiple manifestations of that, I think, across our work. Some of those are more transparent, and I would say, the techniques that, like the obvious greenwashing techniques, etc., like that, which are kind of so cynical and transparent that they at some point they cease to be very interesting. What's more interesting, and I think this is what comes out of some of this field work that we've been doing, and some of the experiences that Jesse has described, is that like when we're in the labs talking to the scientists and engineers who are working on developing these products, and even when we're talking to some of the commercial developers that are working on the market end of some of these products, also the people that are working in the public agencies, that are supporting this research and this commercial development. What the overwhelming sense that I think this is fair to say, the overwhelming sense that we get from them is that they are not cynical in the least. They are not operating cynically in the least. They're operating in good faith, and they often express a great sense of relief that finally they have something to devote their skills to that really matters, that's contributing to the good, that's going to help collectively solve this problem. Like, we very rarely hear anyone talk about what a great market opportunity it is. Once in a while we get that, but quite mostly what we're hearing is, I've been an engineer for 30 years, and I've for so long had to work on making things that did damage or that were just, another way to make money. And now finally I have something to attach my knowledge and expertise to that's going to do real good in the world. And they genuinely believe that, and I think our experience has been that they're not wrong, entirely wrong, right? That they are, and I think so. I guess what I would say is, I think one of the great benefits of bringing field research of this kind into this is it forces us as analysts to re-examine our presuppositions about what it is we're critiquing, about what it is, who it is that our enemy is, about what we're trying to achieve in terms of what needs to be exposed in order to open up the wonderful field of creative possibility that Jesse narrated earlier, because some of the kind of easy preconceived accounts of who the villains are, accounts of what people's motivations are, accounts of where possibility is being shut down and where possibility is being opened up, accounts of what kinds of subjects are being interpolated in capitalist economies. A lot of that gets disrupted in this context, I think. And I think there's something very specific about the green capitalist moment that exposes this, because it's this thing that people can attach to in non-cynical ways, like in very genuine ways. Like, they can attach to. Now, we know through our analysis that it's perpetuating certain kinds of social relations, environmental relations, economic relations that are deeply harmful, that are dispossessive, that are exploitative, etc. But it's harder to or you have to do more work to get at the expression of your critique when the subjects that you're dealing with are not cynical, like whose attachments are real and whose motivations are hard to dismiss. And I think that's a lot in the, like, at least at some level within the space of materials transformation, we're finding that that's the case, that we're dealing with something that's not as easy to categorize as we might have thought going into it.
Yeah, I think there's a ton coming out of that. Go ahead, Hannah.
Oh, I was just going to say that, just to pick up on something that Darin was saying as well, that like maybe there's some kind of, I guess sometimes I think that there's some kernel of possibility in that kind of like that there is this shared feeling that like something's wrong, and that these actors are expressing that in and kind of relating to it in their own ways, and like have certain ways of kind of living that and having their own stories of understanding what that means and what the possibilities for them to act under the conditions of their lives might be. And just to add another like anecdote from the research was that I think one thing that maybe is like slightly different about the material rehabilitation of bitumen and the clean tech spaces that you studied, Jesse, are that we're dealing with a lot of like university researchers and others, but a kind of central actor in funding and scaling some of the technologies that we're looking at are the provincial and federal governments, which kind of like mediates what is possible It mediates the relationship to capital in a slightly different way, maybe. But all to say, one of the spaces that one thing that we found out from a university professor at the University of Calgary that I really left an impression on me was that his students were no longer, this is a petroleum engineer, and his students were no longer interested, he found, in working for big oil companies. And in fact, the undergraduate program in petroleum engineering at the University of Calgary had to be shut down because they had such low enrollment. And so students coming up were no longer interested in kind of working in this field. And I think, again, like those energies get redirected in certain ways, but those are energies, like that's a certain kind of energy or recognition nonetheless, that I think is meaningful. And I think, I guess, yeah, I have other questions maybe for Jesse as well, but we can circle back to those. I'll see where things go.
Well, I mean, I'll just say, like, there is a moment or two in your writing, Jesse, where you talk about how, like, these new innovations that can spawn new industries, new jobs, etc. Like, you say it's impossible to overemphasize the importance of government support in this process. So, like, there is something interesting and maybe like underexplored in terms of like the role of governments in either like colluding with fossil capital and maintaining the status quo, or actually disrupting, to use that term, like disrupting the way things are trending in order to like power innovation in a radically different direction. So I don't know if you wanted to talk about that at all.
Yeah, no, and it'd be interesting to hear what's going on with the provincial governments in your case. But my sense is that, like, when people talk about like Green New Deal kind of imaginaries, or even the hope that's invested in like the COPs and like in global governance, I feel like there's this sort of social democratic Keynesian faith in like a decommodifying welfare state apparatus, right? The possibility that the state could be this like sort of double movement and push against the sort of privatizing, commodifying tendencies of capital. We live in a neoliberal context currently where those aspects of the global nation state system have been atrophying, right? And in its place, you get a market-oriented state apparatus, right? And so I think I hear a lot of the sort of folks in these like green tech conversations really sort of thinking alongside Mariana Mazzucato, right? And thinking about this entrepreneurial state, which is literally just supposed to provide non-dilutable venture investment in new technologies, right? The state should fund cool new technologies, and then once they exist, just give them over to the private sector as like, without even claiming a stake in it, right? So it's become this way where it's like, is it good that the state is investing in some of these technologies? Maybe, but is it part of that narrowing where the forms of investment happen to be the forms that you've got a bunch of private capital chomping at the bit to take on once the viability of a new technology has been proven? It feels to me a little bit like that's the case, right? So you don't see, the state pouring money into innovative small landholder agroecological systems or into ways to circumvent planned obsolescence and come up with sort of like durable consumer goods, whatever I could think of a million things, right, that are not where state funding is going. But where they're going is carbon capture. Where they're going is technologies that will fit right into the private investment space that feels very cozily in collaboration with the state as it's currently constituted.
Yeah, it's like Darin and Hannah, sort of part of this competition for format, right? Like it's a winner take all kind of game, and that's how largely, big tech has talked about the emergence of like a mobile market or whatever. Like it's disruption for the purpose of narrowing, so that whoever narrows it to the point of an accepted format wins the jackpot, right? Do you see that in your research between like bitumen beyond combustion, solidium bits, canapucks, and CN? Like, who's in the lead, and is there mostly that narrowing happening? do you see any room for multiplicity in that sort of competition for format?
Okay, one thing that I would say that's important here is that the Bitumen Beyond Combustion program, both in terms of the provincial government sponsored program, but also the kind of just the action that's happening around developing new formats for the storage, transportation, and use of bitumen across these like multiple formats that are being developed. This is actually still quite a marginal activity in the context of the oil sands. Like, this is not a case where the major oil sands companies are singing the song of, oh, we're going to start now transforming to non-combustion uses, or the Alberta government or the federal government in Canada are like investing heavily in the development of these technologies. There is like measured support from both the federal and the provincial governments in this program of scientific and technological investigation and development, but it's very small in scale relative to the continued investments of both those levels of government in supporting continued oil production and transportation infrastructure in the conventional combustible formats.
Right.
So they're not. This is not being driven either by the dominant interests in the state, or certainly not in the sector. It's this kind of marginal thing that's happening somehow on the side, and in a way that makes it more interesting to us as well, because in the old science and technology studies way, these things that happen on the margins, these like uncertain things that could succeed or fail, is where we learn a lot about how the intersection of capitalism, state, and technology actually operates. And so that's part of the reason why we're so interested in this, is because in a way, like it's a format gambit that is trying to press its way into a field where the massively dominant format is still extraction of this resource for combustion. And so there's just a set of dynamics here that's very interesting to study from the point of view of how, even within the context of a still kind of state capitalist research nexus, how winners and losers emerge, and what paths get taken and not taken, and how marginal actors that might have kind of interesting political possibilities attached to them get either sucked up into dominant frameworks or crushed and cast aside. That might be what happens with bitumen beyond combustion.
Yeah,
it's entirely likely and possible that 10 years from now we'll be telling it as a story of an innovation that did not happen.
Right. Which is so interesting. Like you say, like one of the big challenges is how to think and write in empirically grounded ways about something that for the most part has not happened yet, but which people talk about as though it has. And that seems to be part of the kind of clean tech hype cycle too, right?
Yeah. Well, and the one thing I also wanted to just add that I really feel like I saw in reading your guys' work is this other piece of this legitimizing discourse, or this sort of like way of narrating the good and virtuous potential in a technology, which is this sort of, and this happens in net zero too, which is this sort of like incrementalism and need to sort of create clean and discrete buckets of activity. So like, I'm not thinking about all of the tar sands, just this one dimension of it that I can clean, improve, and make green and decarbonize, right? Or I'm not thinking about, an entire paper mill. I'm just thinking about this one anaerobic digester that I can add into the mix and make that aspect of it more energy efficient, right? And so there's this way in which a lot of these clean tech narratives operate, so long as you can isolate a discrete budget of carbon use or of energy use, or of water use, or of environmental, impact that you can improve, right? And so, and with net zero, it's the same thing, right? It's just sort of like an individual firm will balance its books, its proverbial books, right? But as there's like, ample evidence that sometimes what that means is get your dirtiest stuff off of your books and onto somebody else's, right? And then similarly at the nation state level, right? Like, let's each nation state do its part to like get to net zero. But it's like, so this is an imaginary that says I can't deal with the actual full picture, which is that global climate emissions are just ratcheting up year after year. What I can do is take personal responsibility on my discrete budget and improve it and celebrate that improvement. Because if we all do our part, the hope, I guess, is that there'll be like a sea of incremental improvements that sort of collectively become a global solution. Mm-hmm. But like, what ends up happening that is each individual solution has its sort of outside, right? It's waste receptacle to get rid of the things that make it potentially unsustainable and to only hold on to that which you can improve. And so it's sort of like this, I don't know, it's like, I mean, it's a legitimizing discourse. It's a way to feel good about what you do, which isn't to say that all these technologies are inherently bad. It's just that it's like a partial view of what we're doing. And instead of saying like, look, I'm doing this like one small slice, I'm like trying to imagine how we can do something less awful with bitumen, right? I'm trying to think about global systems, but it's complicated, right? That's not the language we're sort of supposed to speak in, right? We have to have a more sort of ambitious sort of, I'm solving the planet's problems with my incremental solution.
Mm-hmm. There's something always more kind of strategically advantageous about doing the kind of compartmentalization that you're describing, where you can talk about, like, it's far easier to tell stories in which we are winning, right, than stories of shortfalls, right? And this is like what obviously, the kind of work in the energy humanities that does kind of hinge on a structural critique gives us, is like the ability to tell stories in a grounded way, a material way. And yes, we are actually not winning, right? But a kind of like underlying message of like, things did not have to be this way. They are bad, but they still might change. And in fact, moreover, they really need to change, right? Like when it comes to, oil sands or tar sands, bitumen, obviously like just more familiarity, I think, with the substance is needed. A sense of the scale is required. That's not what we get. And in your research, you're talking about how like in 2022, Canadian suppliers produced 3.3 million barrels of heavy oil per day, almost exclusively for use as a fuel. In Canada, we have a lot of bitumen, right? Canada is the third largest oil reserves in the world, behind Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. Like, we're talking about an estimated reserve of 170 billion barrels, right? Almost all of it, 97%, comprised of bitumen located in the oil sands. Like, how many people are aware of the scale of that and what's at stake in terms of our so-called carbon budget, or of like, let's say, the contested nature of the terms that we use for even describing this extractive zone that is the site of so much economic development, right? Tar sands versus oil sands. I think it's just important to talk about climate literacy here, and the extent to which people do get scared off by like the scale of the problem. This is what makes these kind of easy answers and simpler narratives really, really attractive. How do you go at this problem? How do you work around this issue in your teaching, your political work, your artistic practice, whatever it may be? Does anyone want to speak to that?
Another piece of that compartmentalization, I think, and this would be something I would be like self-reflectively critical on, is sometimes compartmentalizing production and consumption, or the technology from the social and technological context within which it's used and deployed. And like, there's a great Tony Fry is this design theorist, right, who I think has like a really, easy way to sort of name it, where he's like, you have a solar panel, it's not clean in and of itself. It depends on like what it's powering, right? And a solar panel on top of like Sunoco's headquarters is different than a solar panel on top of a like rural health clinic, right? And so like when you put energy within its context of what is it doing, why are we making it, and for whom, right? And who's this we? it's a whole different set of questions. And so when I'm teaching, or just in general, when I'm thinking about it, I think that it's important to have a politics that tries to pull these technologies into their circulation beyond just the sort of increment or the specific site of their sort of production or shifting of natures, right? So it's like, what is this non-combusted bitumen going to be used for? Is it asphalt? What is the asphalt being used for? What's driving on those roads? And then all of a sudden you get this full system where it's like, oh, so are we talking about mobility? Okay, well then let's talk about mobility. How do we want to imagine a world of mobility? Does it involve asphalted roads? Does it involve other modes of transportation? What role could then bitumen play in it? Interesting conversation. And maybe there are really interesting and impactful ways that a post, ecocidal world might have a need for some uses of bitumen, right? But like, that's the conversation that can and should be happening, not just how do I incrementally improve each thing without ever thinking about the holistic picture of what the hell are we even doing.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think so. I think that's really insightful, Jesse. And the piece that I would add to that is that when you get to the point that you described, after you've kind of done that scaling discussion that you described, and you ask the question, so is there a non-ecocidal world in which high-quality asphalt derived from not uncombusted bitumen with its high asphaltene content? These are the technical words that Hannah and I are becoming familiar with in our research. Is there a world in which that actually becomes a useful, in which it actually has use value? Let's use that language of ours, right? In which it has use value. That's
maybe
with which it's been developed for that reason, not because of its exchange value or its capacity to generate surplus value, but just because it has use value in an environmental context. If we can imagine a world in which that is in fact possible, how likely is it that a capitalist economy and states that are organized to serve the interests of capitalist economy are going to deliver that world and deliver that asphalt product because of its use value in rationally distributed and implemented ways? And the answer is not very likely, because that's not what that economy is structured to do, and that's not what the state that serves that economy is structured to do. So in fact, if you are open to the possibility that there might be an environmentally sound world that has some high quality asphalt sourced from Alberta bitumen, you're not going to get it if we persist in organizing our economies in the way that we do and organizing our politics in the way that we do at the level of state politics. In order to actually rehabilitate this material, right, there needs to be a political transformation and an economic transformation alongside the material transformation of that carbon. Something like that is what I think captures the political character.
Yeah, and it's a shift. It's a shift from beginning with systems of production, right, or of a technological capacity. Like, we have bitumen and we could do something with it. It's shifting the conversation from that site of production to the site of like world making and life making, of like, what are the systems of provisioning that matter? Do we want health and wellness? Okay, how do we do it? And then you work yourself back to figure out, there might be some petrochemical derived products within our health system that we think are really damn cool, and like wouldn't mind if a tiny sliver of petrochemicals still exist in this world to make a few of these, medical innovations possible. Or maybe not. Right. Or maybe we need to manage a public health infrastructure to minimize the amount of petrochemical derived health equipment necessary, right? And so it's like, these become interesting conversations. If you start with provisioning, how do we want to live? And we meaning a global we, right? Then you work yourself back to, do we need to mess with the bitumen? Maybe, or maybe not, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're kind of describing and is like an alternative mode of like thinking about a different theory of change than something like improvement. A different kind of like orientation to like repair. We're kind of trying to figure out how this idea of rehabilitation fits into these kinds of like different theories of change, I think, for us. And I think one thing that I found so generative about your book, Jesse, is the way that it traces this like particular orientation to improvement as almost like a theory of change that's tied to capital's value form, actually. Like, and I think this comes through like in one of the parts that where you kind of talk about the kind of almost like necessary relationship between improvement and waste. On the other hand, where like waste is this like incitement to value and improvement is this way of like attaching where repair and change become attached to the capitalist value form in a way. And it's also like improvement and waste as these two kinds of ways of thinking, like these two sides of the same coin, are not only like attached to the capitalist value form, but I think like you draw on the history of Locke and how this is like an like tied to the history of agriculture and colonial land dispossession. And I think, yeah, I think it's a powerful kind of critique of how this kind of desire for repair and a kind of investment in the world, like somehow being different than it is now, gets like captured and kind of reoriented in this way. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And I would just shout out, like, Kyle White writes about an epistemology of coordination, which I feel like is another way to sort of really sort of beautifully get at some of these ideas of like, how do we think about the way we live together? How do we think about, systems of reciprocity? How do we sort of place ourselves in a complex world that we want to live with the human and non-human, participants in? Is exactly what gets enclosed, right? Is not improvement. Is the thing that improvement says, no. We're not interested in you having a self-contained or viable, socio-ecological system. We're interested in extracting wealth and seeing how you could be a source of potential capital, right? And so that is the movement of enclosure, of colonial dispossession, right? It's this like move away from a sense that we can coordinate to just like live responsibly and ethically with one another.
Well, and like so often now you hear the sort of like Aaron Benenev like automation discourse that says, we can liberate ourselves from like the economic necessity that makes our time so precious and so fleeting and so difficult to hold on to. And then we'll have the kind of world that you're describing where these voluntary associations let us solve climate change, let us create more resilient communities. And like, that's a beautiful fantasy, that sort of AI hype cycle, now whipped into a frenzy that says that's going to be our exit strategy. But the political transformation Darin's talking about kind of needs to happen before any of that happens, any of that becomes possible. Like the sense of urgency we need, which gets replaced by the patience of incrementalism. It's like we don't have time to even experience the urgency, to dwell with the reality of it, because of like all this economic necessity and debt and a deficit of time. So I think like that to me is a real kind of core part of the problem in a lot of ways, and might potentiate what Hannah's describing as this different orientation to repair, or a kind of different theory of change. Maybe I could ask like one more question, or half cluster of questions.
Yeah.
So there's this thing in your book around like futurity, and your net zero piece is about, in fact, in a way, a different orientation to repair, a different attitude toward time as this thing that is not merely limited to your lifespan. One of the limitations when it comes to climate communication is getting across the fact that climate change as an abstract issue is in fact about our relationship to a really, like vast and almost, impossible to imagine for one human being, like time scale. At least that's the kind of narrative that we can't go there in terms of like the temporal relationship to that future. But I don't know that assumption that people lack that capacity is true. I mean, there's a climate communication company called Potential Energy that just released a report titled "Later is Too Late," where they share survey data that shows that actually the message that resonates most for most audiences is actually the idea that we're doing the work, we're making some sacrifices, we're changing the economy, we're decarbonizing in certain ways for future generations. That's the thing that actually connects with people. And yes, like Ed Conway has this book, Material World, that talks about how, like, if we're on track, which we are not, the so-called break-even year, when atmospheric carbon levels are falling and the economic and climate benefits begin to outweigh the costs, will be around 2080. Like, most of us, probably won't live to see that year. The first generation, he says, that will benefit from this period of sacrifice and investment will be the children of the children who are being born today, right? Mm-hmm. So along these lines, the kind of timescales we're talking about are sort of difficult to get across. Do you have a sense that these sorts of temporalities are now becoming like translatable, bridgeable, that there is a way in which now we can begin, because of climate change, to think in a more kind of multi-generational responsibility pathway?
I will say, like, when I teach, students, I teach like a class called Confronting the Climate Crisis. And when I, in part of the conversation that'll come up with these, predominantly 18 to 20-year-olds is sort of like, they're like, we went to high school and we got fed all of these sort of ideas about how to be like hopeful about climate solutions, but it's all such bullshit that, like, I don't understand how we're supposed to have hope for anything. Like, the world's burning around us. Like, I'm not going to have a future. Like, I don't know about generational. I'm talking about me. And so, like, there's a lot of despair, and there's a lot of like, how am I supposed to make sense of this world and this idea that I'm supposed to be like a college student with like aspirations and a future ahead of me? Mm-hmm. And they're like, what future? And, it's not just environmental. It's also about the economy. It's about the impossibility of like owning a home. It's about, the economic unviability of a good life that they see ahead of them. But
right.
But yeah, I feel like it doesn't feel intergenerational to them. It feels embodied in a sense of their own future. I also would say, this paper about net zero, I use Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's concept of settler futurity to like sort of name this way of being and seeing. And what I would say is I really do think it sits, or it fits, as this sort of willingness to imagine a future, so long as it's a future that I get to live in. And the I here is not just like is not a transformed I. It's like a me living as I do now in the future, right? Mm-hmm. And so I really do see this as like the subjectivity of like a capitalist colonial modernity that fuels, whether it's clean tech or whether it's the Green New Deal or whether it's whatever form of sort of like minority world derived vision of a climate future, right? Mm-hmm. They're predicated on maintaining a world that I can live as I do into the future. Maybe my car is electric instead of,
Sure.
combustion. Maybe there's solar panels on my roof instead of like, or maybe I have a convection oven instead of, gas, but like pretty much the same thing. And right. I'm good with that, And so that feels very damaging to me. I mean, that feels like a part of the problem, just to be perfectly honest. And, when you talked about these full automation sort of luxury communist type thinking, that feels like that's the line in the sand, right? And those guys will sort of critique degrowth thinkers as if it's all just like austerity environmentalism.
Right.
I just disagree. I think what it is it's like when I think about the parts of the degrowth sort of canon or community that I like to think with, it's just like a willingness to accept that I have to transform myself as a settler, as a subject, as a petro subject. I will have to become a non-petro subject if there's going to be a viable future. And that is a hard transition to grapple with. And not one I'm not going to pretend that I figured it out, but I know that that's part of the struggle. It's not just telling Exxon to stop being Exxon or telling Sunoco to stop being Sunoco. It's also about me accepting that part of that will be me becoming somebody I am not currently, you know?
Darin or Hannah, did you want to like share your kind of impressions of this question? Like, I know it's a kind of amorphous question, right? The future itself is like on the line, right? Oxfam just released this report that suggests, like if current economic trends continue, world poverty will not be eradicated for another 229 years. That's a time, why even think in those terms, right? Like, what does it mean to regard a problem from that kind of perspective, right? Projecting this current crisis indefinitely into an impossible future. It's like, what break needs to happen in order for the future to become possible? Is it degrowth from your perspective? Is it the abolition of capitalism? Is it, what do you see?
It's a complicated question. I think maybe just to start with a small piece and picking up on what Jesse was describing in terms of like this idea of becoming a different subject, because I guess it seems like there's like this tricky movement where it's like there's both the question of like becoming a different kind of subject, but then how exactly, like, where do we put that in relation to like collective, distributive, material change? Does it start? I mean, I don't think it necessarily starts with either. They're like recursive things. In a different world, like we would have different political subjectivity inevitably. And so it's necessary for that to be part of like the story of change. But yeah, I guess like I think what you were describing too in terms of like talking to young people, and I mean, I guess I am a relatively young person. And I think that climate change, my response to your question, Scott, about whether it helps us think intergenerationally, I think in some ways it does, but in some ways it can really like eclipse possible futures. I guess maybe one element that I would just add into this kind of thinking about the future in this way is like, especially in conversations around settler futurity, is that one thing I find productive about the way that Indigenous scholars have reframed questions around climate, especially are in terms of like thinking about the economic and ecological crisis that we face as like, do we think of it as a horizon, like a coming horizon, or do we think about it as like a very long history that we are part of in this particular moment? And so I think that maybe, especially if we're thinking about the idea of repair and how to reorient ourselves to the question of repair, it's very important to have like a historical perspective on that, because I think precisely improvement as a mode of repair that again is like attached to this like capitalist value form is very much not about looking at the future, not about looking at the past and like how we've gotten here. It's very much like focused on the urgency of a kind of future horizon of catastrophe rather than that more historical orientation to repair as looking at what the damage is, like assessing what the damage is and like how we've gotten to this place. So that's very much not an answer, but maybe some more thoughts.
I would add, I think, in direct response to your question, Scott, that I do think the growing awareness of climate change has introduced the possibility of both thinking about and being aware of the consequences of action across longer and larger timescales than was previously the case, and that goes in both directions. And like thinking about deeper pasts that have brought us to the environmentally compromised condition of the present, and also projecting generationally into the future. I think that those timescales have been brought into the public conversation in a way that maybe they hadn't been in the past. And then on the question of like, what role do I see myself or my own work or my own practice as an intellectual and an academic and a researcher playing in relation to possible futures? I guess I would say I see it this way, that I think, and maybe this is like, I don't think it's opposed to what Jesse was saying. It might be a little bit different though. Like I see out there in the world lots of action that's oriented toward different, better, alternative futures. Like whether it's taking place in like material practices where people are trying to develop and build alternative ways of being together in the world economically, materially, provisionally, et cetera, whether it's in activist political practices that are oriented toward performing alternative futures and enabling them. And of course, certainly in our field of the environmental humanities, in artful practices that are about envisioning, depicting, summoning, imagining alternative futures across long scales in an attempt to kind of hail the subjects that would inhabit those futures. And I think I don't do that in my own work. I see my own work as serving a more critical function, right? Meaning, so I'm not an envisioner, an imaginer, a representer of alternative futures. Maybe a little bit in my own political life, I do a bit of that practice, but certainly as a scholar and an intellectual, I see my practice more as being about kind of validating that activity from the point of view of confirming that the future is open to it, right? By which I mean kind of continually driving the critical foundational critical assumption that the present has been historically produced and the future will be historically produced and is therefore contingent and open to possibility. And the way that we confirm that is by, unpacking the manner in which present conditions are contingent, not necessary, and demonstrating that and illuminating that in a manner that rises to the complexity of the current condition. That's the job I see our work as doing, in order to, at the end of it, say, it didn't have to be this way, and it doesn't have to be this way.
Absolutely.
Capitalism, of course, and I think this is the great virtue of work such as Jesse's, capitalism has its version of this story as well, but what we demonstrate critically is that it's actually a technique for shutting down possible futures rather than opening them up, ironically, like in the guise of future embrace the possibilities of the future. Our job as critics is to dismantle that and show why it's cynical and a scam relative to a genuine openness to a multiplicity of possible non-capitalist futures. That's what I see our work as being vis-a-vis the future, not necessarily imagining alternatives, but opening up the space for doing so in the face of a dominant social order that constantly seeks to shut down those possibilities.
But the project then is to build power, right? And once you start figuring out what does it mean to build power, you start walking away from, does it mean voting? Does it mean this and that? No, it means like forming a political organization or joining one or asserting yourself collectively and with others. And I think that becomes like a really important conversation to have with students and just in general, to think that like we have been so saturated in this culture of personal responsibility and this idea of individual initiative, that even just that subtle reminder that like the world is made by people collectively, right? You have to do things with other people. And the annoying thing is that, like you said, capitalism knows that, and their form of doing things collectively is entrepreneurial business creation. But there are other forms of doing things collectively that could potentially assert other visions of ways to live and ways to be. And we have to collectively figure out how to empower, build, and amplify those projects.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Darin, you sell yourself short. You are a great supporter of, a champion of the saboteur. You are encouraging sabotage in ways that I find visionary. And in this work, in fact, like you're planting the seed of the sabotorial subject when you say oil and its fluidity required relatively little human labor to flow via pipelines and tanker ships configured to minimize the potential for disruption, thereby serving as technologies of capitalist sabotage of workers' power. Talking about the ways in which sabotage needs to maybe pivot as the companies vie for a different way of shipping bitumen that is akin to coal, is just, I think, trying to kind of establish a way for people to maintain that that energy of sabotage, right? So cool. Yeah. All three of you are doing really cool work, and I really appreciate you making the time to talk to me about it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Scott.